If you were to wake up in a small medieval village, let us say somewhere in rural England around the year 1370, the first thing you might notice, apart from the smell of the smoke-blackened rafters above your head, would be the dryness. In your mouth, water, after all, was not at arm's reach in the way you might expect today. There was no tap to turn, no handle to lift. And so, before the day could begin, someone, perhaps you, would need to fetch it. Your bed, if you could call it that, would be a low pallet stuffed with straw. Flea bites on your ankles would be an unpleasant reminder of the night. You might stretch, ducking under the slanted roof beam, and shuffle toward the low wooden door, the morning chill hitting you immediately. The village is just waking up. Thin lines of smoke begin to rise from a few chimney holes. Chickens scratch idly in the mud between huts. You reach for the water vessel, perhaps a leather bucket, though more likely a rough wooden pail, the staves bound with iron hoops. It is heavier than you'd like, even empty. The well is at the far end of the village. Not every settlement had a centrally placed one. Sometimes it sat inconveniently close to the manor or church, meaning you'd have to pass by people who might stop you with news, gossip, or an idle task. The path is uneven, muddy after the night's rain. You walk carefully. A twisted ankle here is more than an inconvenience. It can mean the loss of work, wages, or food. When you arrive, there may already be a queue. The village well is a social place, though not necessarily in a pleasant way. This is where news travels. Here, you might hear about a neighbor's cow that fell ill, or that the reeve, the village official, is looking for men to repair the road. The water itself lies deep underground, and you can't simply scoop it up. You must lower a rope and bucket hand over hand, listening to the creak of the windlass. When the bucket finally splashes into the cold, dark water, you wait for it to fill, then haul it up slowly. The effort burns in your shoulders. The rope is rough, biting into your skin. Some buckets leak slightly. Nothing to be done but work quickly. You tip the water into your own vessel, then begin the walk back. The slosh and sway mean you must walk steadily, lest you spill what you worked so hard to obtain. And here is the quiet truth that modern convenience has hidden from you. Water is heavy. A single gallon weighs over 8 pounds, and you need more than one trip to supply a household for the day. You will do this again, and perhaps again after that. And on hot days, in dry seasons, the well might drop so low that you have to travel farther, down to the stream outside the village boundary. That trip adds another half hour each way, and the water, muddied by animals upstream, will need to be settled or boiled before use by the time you return home. Your back is already sore. Your day has only just begun, yet you have completed the first of many exhausting chores. The cooking fire must be stoked, the bread dough shaped, the animals fed. But without this water, nothing else can happen. No cooking, no washing, no brewing of ale. And so you stand there, in the low light of the hut, pail at your feet, already wondering how long before you'll have to make the next trip. By mid-morning, the village is fully awake. The sound of distant hammering comes from the smithy, the dull ring of iron against iron. Somewhere, a rooster crows. Late, he has been fooled by the sun slipping in and out of clouds. Children run barefoot through the ruts in the road, darting between chickens and a cart pulled by a slow, patient ox. You have set the first pail of water inside, near the hearth, but already the level is lower. A little has gone into the large pot that hangs above the fire. heating for porridge. Some has been poured into a basin for rinsing vegetables and herbs. A few quick dips of a ladle have been used to rinse hands or mouths. This is the way of medieval water. It is precious, but constantly in motion, never sitting long before it is turned to some task. The idea of running water, steady and endless, is as distant to you as flying to the moon. Here, you must plan every use. Will there be enough for tonight's stew? Can you spare some for washing your only tunic before Sunday? And of course, there is brewing. You might think water was drunk plainly, but in many villages, ale was the safer choice. Not the strong ale of taverns, but a weak, almost sweet small ale brewed in nearly every household. It required water, grain, and time. If today was a brewing day, your trips to the well might double. The alewife, perhaps your own mother, or the woman in the next hut, would be keeping a close watch on the pails, urging you to fill them faster. Fetching water is rarely a solitary task in the middle of the day. If you go now, you might walk with neighbors. The road to the well becomes a kind of moving conversation. Talk of whose pig wandered off, of the upcoming feast day, of the weather's impact on barley or oats. Even complaints about sore backs from carrying too much are exchanged like greetings. When you reach the well this time, the queue is longer. A shepherd has come down from the pasture with 2 skin bags to fill. A boy is trying to lower the bucket too quickly, splashing himself in the face. And here is an unspoken etiquette. If the manor steward arrives, his turn jumps ahead of yours. Water for the manor house takes precedence over water for the cottages. You may pause, wiping sweat from your brow, and notice the well's details. Its stones are smooth from centuries of hands and ropes. Some say it is older than the church, older than the manor itself. The bucket, too, is patched and repaired, for iron hoops are costly and must be mended by the smith, who will accept payment in grain or labor if coin is scarce. Carrying the second pail home is harder. The morning's strength is gone, and the sun feels heavier than the water. The handle digs into your palm. You shift it from one hand to the other, each step reminding you of the distance still to go. A child waves at you from the lane, calling out some news you can barely make sense of over the noise of geese back home. You set the second pail near the door, beside the first. You know that before nightfall, both will be nearly empty, and tomorrow you will do this again and again. Yet even in this repetition, there is a kind of rhythm, a quiet assurance that, as long as the well is full, so too will your household be supplied. But what happens when the well runs dry, as it sometimes does in the height of summer? It is late July now in our imagined medieval village, and the air feels thicker than usual. The thatch above your head traps the heat, so the only relief is stepping outside, though the sunlight quickly turns that into its own trial. The ground is cracked in places. The mud ruts along the road long since baked hard. When you reach the well this morning, you hear the sound before you see it, the hollow clink of the bucket striking dry stone. The water level has sunk low, too low for the bucket to reach without scraping the sides. The woman ahead of you in line hauls up her rope only to find the bucket a third full. The water cloudy from the disturbed silt. A murmur passes down the queue. People shift from one foot to the other, fanning themselves with their hands. This is no surprise. Dry summers can draw the water table lower each week. The well may yet recover after a rain, but for now, every household will need to make choices. Some water will be reserved strictly for drinking and cooking, washing clothes, tools, or bodies will be postponed. The alternative lies beyond the village boundary. The stream, it is shaded in places, its water slow and cool, but it is also shared by animals. Hoofprints churn the muddy banks, and in the shallows, you can see the long drag marks where oxen have been led in to drink. Filling your pails here means carrying not only water, but the need to strain or boil it before use. Boiling itself requires more fuel, another scarce resource, and so each trip becomes heavier, not only in weight, but in calculation. Which task will be delayed today? Will the barley mash for ale be put off until tomorrow? Will the children be told to rinse their hands in the small basin rather than wash fully at the stream? The journey to and from the stream also changes the shape of your day. It adds nearly an hour to each trip, which means fewer other chores completed before nightfall. If you are a tenant farmer, this may affect your ability to meet obligations. To the manor to weed the Lord's fields, repair fences, or tend the sheep. You begin to understand why water rights and the upkeep of wells were matters for the whole community. Without them, survival turns into a private struggle. When at last you return home, shoulders aching, the air smells faintly of the evening cook fires starting up. You set the pails down and glance toward the horizon. Clouds are gathering there, dark and swollen. If they break before nightfall, the well may begin to fill again by morning, in the quiet. You realize something. The act of fetching water is not merely a chore in this world. It is the unseen thread that ties together every meal, every drink, every clean face, every working day. Remove it, and life here begins to unravel in ways you might never have considered in your own time. And as you drift to sleep, the sound of the wind in the thatch above your head, you wonder if tomorrow the clouds pass without rain, how many more days before the village well gives nothing at all. Asterisk, you might imagine that in the medieval world, shoes were sturdy things, thick leather soles, perhaps meant for trudging over fields and cobbled streets. But the truth is far less practical. If you woke up in, say, a small English market town around the year 1420, and slipped your feet into the footwear of the day, you'd quickly discover something. Medieval shoes were built for a world smaller in scale, slower in pace, and far rougher on the feet. The morning begins as you slide your feet into turn shoes, the common style for centuries. They are called that because they are made inside out. The leather stitched along the sole is sewn with the seams inward. Then the whole shoe is turned right side out before wearing. It's clever craftsmanship, but it means the sole is thin, often just a single layer of cowhide, no thicker than a heavy belt. The first thing you notice is how the earth presses through the leather. Every pebble on the lane is felt like a small announcement to your heel or toes. The market town's main street is paved in some places, but not in the modern sense. Stones are laid unevenly, with gaps that collect water and mud. Your shoes absorb this quickly. Medieval leather is rarely treated with waterproofing unless you can afford extra tallow or oil. And even then, a sudden puddle will seep in cold within moments. Fashion, of course, has its say in this matter. The early 15th century is the age of the poulain shoes, with elongated, pointed toes, sometimes absurdly long among the wealthier classes. For you, as an ordinary town dweller, the point is modest, perhaps a few inches, but it still alters your stride. You walk with a slight outward sweep of the foot to keep from tripping. The nobleman up the street wears points so long they are tied to his knees with silk cords to keep them from folding. Practical, not at all. But fashion rarely bows to practicality. The market today is busy. Stalls spill out into the street. A fishmonger gutting herring. A woman selling onions by the bundle. A potter with clay jugs lined in neat rows. You weave between them, trying not to step in the soft heaps left by the cart horses, but the shoes offer little defense. Step in the wrong place, and you'll carry that smell with you until you reach a water trough. Durability is another concern. A pair of turn shoes might last only a few months if worn daily on rough ground. Cobblers are kept busy patching soles or sewing on new ones. Many people, especially in rural areas, go barefoot in summer to save their shoes for church or special occasions. For a journey between towns, one might carry the shoes slung over the shoulder until the final mile, putting them on only when arriving. After all, it's one thing to endure thin soles on market day, quite another to do so for 10 miles straight. By midday, your feet feel every step. The leather has softened with the warmth and damp, and you can sense the uneven stitching beneath your toes. And yet, everyone around you carries on, as they have for centuries. The shoemaker's stall stands near the churchyard, its wares hanging like deflated animals from wooden pegs. If you pause to look, you'll see rows of near-identical shapes, the same low cut, the same thin sole. A reminder that here, shoes are not about cushioning or arch support. They are about covering your feet just enough to pass as properly shod. Still, as you turn toward home, you feel the cobblestones again, pressing their pattern into your soles. Tomorrow you'll wear the same pair, and the day after that. But what happens when the seasons change, and the streets turn to ice and slush? Autumn in a medieval town changes the ground beneath your feet almost overnight. The dry dust of summer turns to thick, clinging mud with the first steady rains. And if you are wearing turn shoes, you will feel it in more ways than one. The soles, thin as they are, pick up the cold immediately, the leather darkening and softening until each step feels as though you are walking on damp parchment. The town's lanes are not designed for clean feet. Wastewater from washing pots, from brewing ale, from rinsing hides at the tanner's, is tossed directly into the street. The rain pushes it all into the wheel ruts, mixing with the straw meant to soak it up. And there you are, stepping through it in shoes that offer no barrier to the seep. Even the small gap at the edge where sole meets upper is enough to let in a creeping chill that settles into your toes and stays there. Some wealthier townsfolk own pattens, wooden overshoes, strapped to the bottom of regular shoes to raise the wearer above the muck. They are a clattering, awkward contraption, but they can mean the difference between dry feet and a sodden day. For most people, though pattens are too costly or impractical, you simply accept that your feet will be wet, and you dry the shoes by the hearth at night, hoping they stiffen enough to hold their shape in the morning. Then comes winter. The mud hardens to ridged frost, and in the coldest weeks, patches of ice form where a gutter trickle has frozen mid-flow. Turn shoes have no tread. The soles are as smooth as the leather belt at your waist. Each step on ice is a negotiation, a sliding shuffle, a hope that you do not land flat on your back with your basket of onions scattered across the lane. Woolen hose help keep your feet warm, though they too soak quickly. If you have coin, you might line your shoes with felt or even straw, a trick borrowed from rural laborers. But these are stopgaps, not solutions. The reality remains, your shoes were not built for comfort, and the seasons do not take pity on thin leather. The cobbler's work in these months is steady. People bring in shoes with soles worn through to the stitching, heels separating where the thread has rotted from damp. Repairs are made with whatever materials are on hand. Patches of thicker leather, if the cobbler can get them, or in lean times, stitched scraps that leave an uneven step. If you are handy, you might attempt the repair yourself, though the curved cobbler's needle is awkward and the waxed thread stiff. In these colder months, journeys take longer, not only because of the weather, but because of the need to tread carefully. Even within the town walls, a simple errand can mean returning home with cold, numbed toes and shoes that must be thawed before they can be removed. And yet, you might wonder, if shoes were so poorly suited to long walks and harsh weather, what did people wear when they travelled far across counties, or even across countries? Long-distance travel in the medieval world was rare for most people. But when it did happen, a pilgrimage, a merchant's route, a summons to court, the question of footwear became more than just a matter of daily nuisance. Turn shoes, which might suffice for the short lanes between home, church, and market, were sorely tested on the open road. If you set out from your town for, say, Canterbury or York, the roads would vary wildly, stretches of hard-packed earth, scattered with stones that bruised the soles, long muddy tracks where wagon wheels had carved deep ruts, sudden crossings over shallow streams where you would wade in, shoes and all, because there was no bridge. By the second day, the leather would be soft and swollen, the seams beginning to gape. By the fourth, unless the weather was dry, you might find yourself with wet feet from sunrise to sunset. Travelers developed their own strategies. Some wore thicker boots, not common turn shoes, but ankle-high designs with doubled soles. Though these were heavier and far more expensive, pilgrims often carried their shoes and walked barefoot for stretches, partly as a devotional act and partly to spare the leather. In colder seasons, travelers might wrap rags or bits of felt around their shoes for extra insulation, binding them in place with strips of cloth or cord. Merchants who valued both speed and the safety of their wares sometimes hired carts or pack animals to carry not only goods but also extra pairs of shoes. A fresh, dry pair could mean finishing a journey without crippling blisters. Soldiers on campaign were issued sturdier boots than civilian turn shoes, though these were still rudimentary compared to anything you know today. Many armies had cobblers travelling with them, repairing shoes nightly by lamplight. And then there were the wealthy, those who travelled with retainers and wagons, their shoes carried for them, perhaps even changed mid-journey to suit the roads. Condition, their fine poulains, with their ridiculous points, might only touch the ground in the last half-mile before arriving at a manor house or city gate. The rest of the time, they could sit in a covered wagon, feet dry, toes warm, blissfully, unaware of the soreness that plagued the common traveller. For everyone else, the medieval shoe was a compromise, cheap enough to replace when it failed, simple enough to make with local tools and materials, and just sturdy enough to keep the worst of the road from cutting your feet. Comfort was not the point. Endurance was backed in your own small town. Returning from even a modest journey, you might sit by the fire, unlace your damp shoes, and see the faint outline of every stone you stepped on pressed into your soles. Tomorrow you'll wear them again, perhaps to the market or the church, short walks that seem merciful after days on the road, and you will know, perhaps more than ever, that medieval shoes were made to get you there, just not very comfortably. If you woke up in a medieval household with bread on your mind, you'd quickly discover that the idea of a fresh, warm loaf by lunchtime was nothing more than a fantasy. In this world, bread is not a quick errand. It is a slow, deliberate undertaking that begins not in the kitchen, but in the field. weeks, or even months before you eat it. The bread you plan to bake today actually began its journey last summer, when the grain, perhaps wheat, rye, barley, or a mixture of all three, was harvested. This grain has been stored through the winter in sacks or bins, kept as dry as possible to avoid mold, and guarded from rats with whatever means you have: cats, traps, or simply sheer vigilance. When the time comes to make bread, the first step is grinding the grain into flour, and unless you are fortunate enough to live near a watermill or windmill, that means hours of manual labor. Hand mills, or querns, are two heavy circular stones. You pour grain into a hole in the top stone and turn it, grinding the kernels into a coarse powder. The work is slow and physical, your arms aching from the constant motion, and the result is not the fine, white flour of modern bakeries. It is flecked with bits of bran and chaff, making the bread darker and denser. In some villages, milling must be done at the Lord's mill. This means carrying your sack of grain to the miller, who will grind it for a fee, often a portion of your grain itself. The miller's reputation is not always spotless. Tales of millers taking more than their due are common enough to be part of folk songs. Still, a watermill can grind in an hour what might take you all day with a quern. So you pay, grumble, and carry home your flour. Now you have your flour, but the day is already waning. Bread making is rarely done from start to finish in a single morning. There is sifting to be done if you want a finer texture, shaking the flour through a cloth or wicker sieve to remove larger husks. There is measuring, if such a thing exists in your household, or simply judging by handfuls. And there is the yeast, which, in most cases, is not the tidy powdered packet you might know today, but a portion of leftover dough from the last baking, kept alive by careful feeding and storage. The yeast must be woken up, coaxed into life, which can take hours in the cooler seasons. Sometimes ale balm, the frothy top from fermenting beer, is added to speed the process. The dough, once mixed, must be kneaded, and this is labor of the most literal kind, pressing, folding, and working the mass until your shoulders are sore and your palms raw. By the time the dough is ready for its first rise, the light outside may already be dimming. This is why many households begin bread one day and bake it the next. The long rising, often overnight, gives the yeast time to work without robbing the baker of precious daylight for other chores. But this is only the first day's work. Tomorrow, the oven itself must be readied, and that is a process worthy of its own long morning. When dawn comes, the dough is waiting. It has sat all night in a cool corner of the house, under a cloth, rising slowly in the quiet darkness. You lift the covering to see that it has grown softer, puffed slightly, the surface marked with small bubbles, but you cannot bake it yet. First, the oven must be brought to life. Most village households do not have their own large baking oven. A proper bread oven is a costly thing, built from clay, brick, or stone, shaped like a dome to trap heat. It requires not only the materials to build it, but also the fuel to heat it, and fuel is a resource no one wastes. Instead, many villages have a shared bakehouse. Families take turns using it, or sometimes everyone bakes on the same day, with each household's loaves marked by a small cut or stamp, so they can be told apart. If you are lucky enough to have your own oven, or if it is your turn at the communal one, you must begin by building a fire inside it, not under or beside, but in the very chamber where the bread will bake. You use bundles of dry sticks, sometimes called faggots, or larger logs if the weather has been wet and the sticks are scarce. The fire burns for hours, heating the thick walls of the oven until they can hold the necessary heat. This is not guesswork without some skill to cold, and the bread will bake pale and tough. Too hot, and it will scorch before the inside. Cooks, experienced bakers, test the temperature by tossing in a handful of flour. If it browns slowly, the heat is right. If it blackens at once, you must wait. Another trick is to hold your bare arm inside and count the seconds before the heat forces you to pull back. A primitive but surprisingly accurate measure. Once the oven is hot enough, the coals are raked out and the floor swept clean. The heat remains trapped in the thick clay or stone, slowly radiating inward to the loaves. This is why oven building is an art. It must be able to hold enough heat to bake several rounds of bread without needing to be fired again. While the oven heats, the dough is shaped into loaves. This is your second chance to work the dough, punching it down to release air, folding it again, and shaping it into rounds or long loaves, depending on local custom. In some regions, the loaves are flat and wide. In others, they are thick and high. Bakers sometimes score the tops to control how the bread cracks as it rises in the oven. But decorative cuts are rare among common households. By now, hours have passed. The fire has burned to embers, the oven is swept, and the air smells faintly of warm clay and ash. The loaves are ready, waiting on a wooden board or cloth. You load them in quickly with a long-handled peel, each movement practiced and smooth. For the oven loses heat every time its mouth is open. Then comes the waiting. The oven is sealed with a wooden or clay door, sometimes sealed further with wet cloth or clay to keep in the heat. Outside, the day goes on. Children run past with errands. Someone drives a cart of hay down the lane. A dog barks at a passing stranger. Inside the oven, the bread rises and browns in the trapped warmth, transforming slowly from dough to the solid weight of a finished loaf. And yet, you are not finished. For in many medieval households, bread baking day is also the day to make use of the oven's dying heat for pies, stews, or even a batch of dried fruit. The bread will come out first, but the oven will work for you until the very last ember cools. But what happens when something goes wrong, when the yeast fails, or the oven misfires, or the bread burns? Even in a village where bread has been done for generations, the process is not foolproof. A single misstep can turn to days of careful work into an inedible disaster. The stakes are high. Bread is not just food, it is the backbone of survival. And a failed bake means more than disappointment. The most common failure begins before the oven is even lit: the yeast. In the medieval world, yeast is not a neat packet from a shop, but a living, unpredictable presence, drawn from the air or borrowed from yesterday's dough. A healthy starter is a family treasure, kept alive in a cool corner, fed regularly with flour and water. But starters can sicken, an unwelcome mold can take hold, or a cold spell can slow its activity to near nothing. If the yeast is weak, the dough will sit heavy and flat, baking into a dense hard loaf that even the strongest teeth will resent. Then there is the weather. Rain can make firewood damp, lengthening the time needed to heat the oven and making it harder to maintain the perfect baking temperature. In some seasons, winds can fan a fire too quickly, causing the oven to overheat before the dough is ready. In winter, a cold bakehouse may cool the oven faster than planned, leaving bread pale and underdone. Even a well-timed bake can go wrong during loading. A loaf that sticks to the peel will fold over itself, baking misshapen. Another might land, too close to the oven wall, scorching on one side. A careless sweep of the oven floor can leave a smudge of ash that bakes into the crust, harmless, but bitter tasting, and there is always the chance of burning. The same heat that bakes beautifully can also destroy in moments. A distracted baker, drawn away by a knock at the door or a sudden farm chore, may return to find the crust hardened to blackness, the smell sharp in the air. Burnt bread can be scraped and salvaged, but it is never quite right. Still, medieval households waste nothing. A loaf that is too hard might be boiled into pottage, or sliced thin and dried further to become rusks for travelers. Even the blackened crust can be ground into crumbs for thickening soups. In times of hunger, a failed loaf is still food, and food is never taken lightly. Bread baking, then, is as much about resilience as it is about skill. You cannot control every element, the weather, the yeast, the wood, the oven, but you learn to adapt, to salvage, and to keep trying. The next baking day will come soon enough, and with it, another chance to get it right. By the time the bread is cooled and set on the table, the day is nearly over. The loaves are solid, warm, and heavy in the hand, ready to feed a household for the week ahead. And yet, when you slice into one, you remember every step it took to get here. The soaking, the grinding, the kneading, the waiting, the tending of fire. In a world without shortcuts, bread is never just bread. It is time, labor, and the slow patience of 2 days' work. But if bread could take 2 days, what of the drink that often accompanied it? One that could take weeks, even months, to prepare, and without which no medieval table was complete. You might imagine a medieval bed as something simple, a rough frame, a lumpy mattress, maybe a scratchy blanket. But to truly understand where a medieval person laid their head at night, you have to think beyond furniture. You have to think of status, of craft, of season, and of the stubborn realities of a world without central heating, insect control, or mattresses in neat plastic wrapping. The bed was not just where you slept. It was a stage for your social standing, a symbol of your household's worth, and in some cases, a place of business. In the homes of the wealthy nobles, merchants, clergy of high rank, a bed was a masterpiece. Wooden frames carved with intricate designs, headboards high and paneled, posts rising at each corner to hold thick drapes or a canopy. These were not purely decorative. Curtains trapped warmth, shielded sleepers from drafts, and created a private chamber within a larger room, useful if your servants, children, and visitors often entered without knocking. For the poor, there might be no bed frame at all. Sleeping could be as simple as spreading a pallet, a cloth sack stuffed with straw, reeds, or dried grass on the floor, and rolling it up each morning to make space in the one-room dwelling. If you had a little more means, you might own a wooden bench or platform to keep the pallet off the cold, damp ground regardless of class. The mattress was rarely a soft, bouncy thing. The most common filling was straw, replaced once or twice a year, more often if you were fussy or infested. Straw flattened quickly, forming hard ridges, and it had a particular sound, a faint rustle each time you moved. Some preferred chaff, the husks left over from threshing grain, but this could poke through the fabric and irritate the skin. The wealthiest used feathers for their beds, goose, duck, or swan down, though even these could develop lumps and needed daily shaking to keep comfortable. Then there were the blankets. In the absence of electric heating, layering was key. Wool was the fabric of choice, thick and heavy, sometimes woven in colorful patterns for those who could afford them. Linen sheets were cooler and more comfortable in summer, but expensive. In winter, pelts or furs might be added, especially in northern climates where the cold seeped in through every wall. The art of staying warm in a medieval bed was not just about the covers, it was about who you shared them with. Bed was common, especially in cold months. Families often slept together for warmth, and travelers at inns might find themselves assigned to the same bed as strangers. The idea of sleeping alone in a large bed was a luxury reserved for kings and lords. Sleeping positions were sometimes deliberate, too. In the coldest parts of the year, people curled tightly under their covers, pulling the blankets over their heads to trap their breath for warmth. This had the side effect of making the air stuffy and possibly sharing it with the fleas and lice that loved warm enclosed spaces, and fleas were a constant. No matter how grand your bed, insects found their way in. Straw beds were especially inviting to them, providing both food and nesting material. Feathers, too, could harbor pests. There was no real way to be entirely free of them. At best, you could manage the irritation with regular cleaning, sunlight, exposure, or herbal repellents like lavender and pennyroyal. The smell of a medieval bed could be as distinct as its feel. Straw had a dry, earthy scent. Wool blankets carried the lanolin tang of sheep. Unwashed linen gathered the odor of the body. Furs held the musk of the animal. For the wealthy, beds might also be perfumed, sprigs of rosemary or sweet rushes tucked into the mattress. Both to scent the bed and deter pests. The bedchamber itself played its role. In poorer homes, the bedroom was the main room, with the bed tucked into a corner. In larger homes, the bed was often placed in a heated solar or a room above the main hall. In castles, thick stone walls meant that even in summer, the air was cool, and in winter, freezing drafts were unavoidable unless you had heavy hangings and a roaring fire. Nighttime routines were part of the bed story, too. By candle or rushlight, one might undress, though undress could simply mean loosening a belt or removing a cloak. Sleeping naked was rare in colder climates. Most people slept in a chemise, tunic, or shift. Those with the means might have a specific nightcap or coif to keep the head warm. Climbing into bed was not the end of the night's movement. Many households rose at least once before morning to tend the fire, check on livestock, or even relieve themselves. In winter, this meant braving the cold air, perhaps returning to a bed that had already lost its warmth. In short, the medieval bed was not the warm, pest-free sanctuary we imagine today. It was functional, symbolic, and often communal. It was a place where you slept, talked, planned, and sometimes even transacted business. But if this is where you lay your head, the question remains, how did you stay warm, truly warm, through a long medieval night when even the best beds could not hold heat for long? Asterisk, if you have ever slept in an unheated stone building in midwinter, you will understand the medieval obsession with warmth. It was not just comfort, it could be a matter of survival. Night temperatures in parts of Europe could drop far below freezing, and even the wealthiest castles were essentially stone refrigerators with a fire at one end. Medieval people had several strategies for keeping warm at night, some of which we might find oddly inventive, or oddly intimate. One of the simplest methods was the use of bed curtains. These were not flimsy bits of fabric, but heavy wool or thickly woven linen drapes that could be drawn round the entire bed. In a small, enclosed space, the warmth from bodies and breath could raise the temperature noticeably. They also blocked drafts, which were constant in houses with ill-fitting windows or open shutters. Enter the bed warmer. Picture a long-handled brass or copper pan filled with hot coals from the fire, slid between the sheets to warm them up before the sleeper climbed in. This was quick and effective, though one had to be careful. A moment's carelessness, and you could scorch the bedding or fill the bedchamber with the acrid scent of singed wool. A safer option, for those with the skill to make it, was the stoneware bottle filled with hot water, corked, and slipped into the bed to radiate heat. In poorer households, the surest way to keep warm was simple. Share a bed. Families slept close together, often all in the same space, sometimes with animals tucked nearby for extra warmth. In rural cottages, it was not unheard of for a piglet, lamb, or dog to curl at the foot of the bed. This was practical. Livestock body heat was welcome, though one imagines it also brought a unique bouquet of smells. Layering bedding was an art. Wool blankets, linen sheets, furs, sometimes even cloaks, doubled as extra covers in winter. The heaviest layer went on top, pressing down the rest to trap heat. In northern climates, sleeping under a full sheepskin, hide and all, was considered perfectly sensible. While modern sleepers often prefer lighter clothing, medieval people tended to wear more to bed, not less. A long linen or woolen shift, perhaps, with a second tunic over it, kept heat in. Nightcaps were common, not just for fashion, but for warmth. A great deal of body heat is lost through the head. Hands might be covered with mittens, and socks or foot traps were not unusual. The location of the bed in the room mattered. In the absence of insulation, beds were positioned away from exterior walls and windows when possible. In the great halls of castles, beds might be moved closer to the hearth in winter months, but never too close, lest sparks catch the bedding. A fire in the bedchamber was a luxury most could not afford, both for safety and expense. In larger homes, the coals from the main hearth were banked before bed, buried under ash to keep them smouldering so they could be rekindled in the morning without flint and steel. The psychological comfort of knowing the fire would be there in the morning was almost as important as its heat. There is also the curious habit of segmented sleep. In the medieval world, it was common to wake after a few hours, get up for an hour or so, and then return for a second sleep. This might involve stoking the fire, checking on animals, or engaging in quiet tasks before returning to the now slightly warmer, slightly less draughty bed. Warmth, then, was never taken for granted. It was built up in layers, in bodies, in habits, each night a small battle against the cold. Even so, not everyone won. Frost on the inside of windows, numb fingers in the morning, and beds that grew steadily colder through the night were simple facts of medieval life. No matter how carefully a medieval bed was made, it was rarely occupied by humans alone. The warm, enclosed spaces, layers of straw, fabric, fur, made perfect homes for a multitude of small, unwelcome creatures. In an age before insecticides, bedbugs, fleas, lice, and mites were simply part of life. Their bites might keep you awake, but for the most part, they were tolerated, because they could not be eliminated. Straw mattresses were not permanent fixtures. In many households, they were remade at least twice a year. Over time, straw broke down into dusty chaff, which harbored insects and absorbed sweat and spilled food. It was a perfect breeding ground for fleas. Some households added aromatic herbs such as lavender, rosemary, or pennyroyal to the straw to deter pests. These might have helped slightly, but never fully solved the problem. Even the wealthy, who slept on featherbeds instead of straw, could not avoid lice. Lice infestations were so common that regular knit combing was a part of household routine. Linen sheets could be boiled, but in large households, the effort of laundering them was immense. Washing days were rare, and bedding was often simply aired in the sun or beaten outdoors to remove dust and some insects. Fur was valued for warmth, but it also provided ideal hiding places for parasites. Moths might nibble at the fur, while fleas nestled deep in its dense fibers. If you had a fur-lined blanket, you might also have a fur-lined insect colony. In rural homes, cats and dogs sometimes slept in or near the bed. Cats kept rodents at bay, and dogs provided warmth. But both also brought their own fleas, pests, that would gladly transfer to human hosts. Today, the thought of sleeping with fleas or lice would alarm us. In the Middle Ages, however, such pests were so common that they were barely remarked upon, except in moments of extreme infestation. This tolerance was partly necessity. Without effective chemical or mechanical extermination, one could only reduce the problem, not solve it. Various remedies were tried, sprinkling beds with powdered herbs, fumigating rooms with smoke, or sleeping with sachets of strong-smelling plants around the neck. Some even recommended sleeping in a linen shirt coated with lard and herbs to lure lice away from the skin. Though this was more a folk belief than an effective method to sleep in the medieval world was to accept discomfort. Cold draughts, itchy bites, the smell of damp straw, all were woven into the nightly experience. Those who grew up in such conditions may have simply learned to ignore them or to scratch without fully waking. Yet, despite these realities, people still found comfort in their beds. A warm body beside you, a blanket drawn up under your chin, the muffled quiet of a room curtained against the night. These were small luxuries. Even in a world full of crawling bedfellows, the human capacity to rest remained on so. The medieval bed was both haven and hazard, a place of warmth and safety, yet never entirely free from the uninvited company of nature's smaller creatures. When you picture a medieval banquet, perhaps you imagine a long wooden table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, cheeses, and steaming pies. Candles flicker in iron sconces, and the air is thick with the mingled scent of spiced wine and roasting game. You might imagine guests with goblets in hand, carving into their food with fine silver cutlery. But in truth, one item that we take for granted today, the fork, was almost entirely absent from the European table for centuries. In most of medieval Europe, eating was a surprisingly hands-on affair. Knives and spoons were common, but forks were rare curiosities associated with decadent foreign habits. Instead, fingers did much of the work, guided by an intricate set of table manners designed to keep the act of eating dignified, or at least acceptable, in a time when grease and gravy inevitably coated the hands. Every diner was expected to bring their own knife, a personal possession often carried in a sheath at the belt. The knife was used to cut meat from a shared platter, and to spear morsels for eating. Spoons were available for soups, stews, and soft foods. Forks, when they appeared at all, were two-pronged, and used mostly for cooking or serving, not for personal eating. In medieval Europe, forks were seen as strange imports from Byzantium or the Islamic world. Venetian merchants occasionally brought them home from their travels, but they were regarded with suspicion. In the 11th century, A Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulos scandalized the Venetian court by using a golden fork at meals. Critics saw it as excessive refinement, even sinful, as some churchmen declared that God had given humans fingers for a reason. Asterisk. Medieval meals were communal in a way we would find startling. Diners often shared trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as edible plates. Two people might eat from the same trencher, tearing off pieces of bread and using them to scoop up food. At the end of the meal, the trencher, now soaked in juices, might be eaten or given to the poor. Wine, ale, or mead was often drunk from shared cups or mugs. This made etiquette essential. You were expected to drink neatly, wipe your mouth before passing the cup, and avoid double-dipping into communal sauces. Asterisk, since hands were the primary eating tools. Washing before and after meals was a ritual in itself. A servant or household member would bring a ewer and basin, pouring water over each guest's hands. This was both practical and symbolic. Clean hands were a mark of respect to your host and fellow diners. Still, clean was relative. Soap was not always used, and in colder months, washing might be perfunctory at best. In rural households, the idea of hand washing before eating could be less consistent, though in noble courts, it was strictly observed. Asterisk, the absence of forks did not mean the absence of manners. Medieval courtesy books instructed diners to break bread neatly, avoid stuffing their mouths, chew with the mouth closed, and not to lick their fingers until the meal's end. Knives were to be used delicately, without aggressive stabbing. And above all, one was never to reach across another diner's plate, a rule that has happily survived into modern etiquette. Asterisk, without individual plates, the table itself became a complex geography of food. Large platters held roasted meats, fish, and pies, and sauces were served in small communal bowls. A medieval diner would tear a piece of bread, slice meat onto it with their knife, dip it into sauce, and eat all without a fork. The pace was steady but unhurried. Banquets might last hours, punctuated by conversation, music, or the arrival of new courses. As you imagine this forkless feast, consider how much of our modern eating habits are shaped by tools, and how different a meal might feel if you had to rely only on your fingers, a knife, and a spoon. But how did such a system handle the mess, the grease, the crumbs, the inevitable spillage in an age before napkins were common? In our time, the napkin is a small, unremarkable thing, a folded square of cloth or paper, there when you need it, unnoticed when you don't. But in the Middle Ages, the humble napkin, at least as we know it, was far from a common sight. And yet medieval diners faced the same inevitable reality you would face if you ate roast goose or beef stew with your bare hands. Grease, thick, dripping grease. Asterisk, in wealthier households, cloths might be hung at intervals along the table or near the washing basin, and diners could rise and clean their hands when necessary. Sometimes, long strips of linen called mains were placed in the center of the table for communal use, everyone wiping their fingers on the same fabric, which would be washed afterward. But more often, in less formal settings, grease found its way elsewhere. A sleeve might discreetly serve as a wiping cloth, particularly if one's garments were made of sturdy wool rather than delicate silk. Coarse bread also doubled as a grease sponge. A diner could wipe fingers on the crust and then feed the soiled bread to dogs waiting under the table. Asterisk. Dogs were not just tolerated, but often welcomed at medieval banquets. They served as living garbage disposals, snapping up dropped morsels, gnawing discarded bones, and consuming unwanted trenchers soaked with meat juices. Their presence reduced waste, but also created its own problems: fleas, the occasional scuffle over a bone, and the risk of a guest's sleeve being licked clean without consent. It's worth remembering that banquets were slow affairs. There was time to clean one's hands between courses, time to pause, talk, and wait for the next dish to be brought out. Servants moved between tables with pitchers of wine, platters of meat, and basins for hand washing. The soundscape was a mix of clinking knives, crackling hearth fires, the hum of conversation, and the occasional sound of a lute or harp. The absence of a fork made eating a more tactile experience. You could feel the grain of bread under your fingers, the softness of cheese, the slickness of a slice of roasted eel. Meals were as much about texture as taste, and one's sense of touch was fully engaged. In noble households, table manners weren't just about cleanliness. They were a form of social display. The way you handled your food spoke volumes about your upbringing, self-control, and refinement. To tear meat neatly from a bone, to break bread evenly without scattering crumbs, to keep your sleeves free of grease, these were all subtle marks of distinction. It was also important not to eat too greedily. At shared tables, food was often brought in limited portions, and you were expected to take your share without overreaching. Some courtesy manuals advised taking only from the side of the platter nearest you, leaving the choicest cuts for higher-ranking guests. Although forks were rare, they were not entirely unknown. By the 14th and 15th centuries, they began to appear more often in Italy, particularly in wealthy merchant cities like Venice and Florence, where contact with the East was strong. But they remained symbols of foreign luxury, not yet an everyday tool. Fork adoption in the rest of Europe was slow. Even when they were available, many preferred the familiarity of eating with knife and fingers. For centuries, the fork was seen as an unnecessary affectation, something for the overly refined, not for the sturdy, practical eater. And yet, by the end of the Middle Ages, the fork's slow creep into elite dining culture had begun. But what finally changed European minds about the fork, after centuries of resistance? The eventual triumph of the fork over the hand was not an inevitable march of progress, but rather a slow, hesitant negotiation between practicality, custom, and fashion. For centuries, Europe had eaten perfectly well, or so they thought. Without this two-pronged newcomer, the fork's path into common use was paved less by necessity and more by shifting ideas about hygiene, civility, and status. It was in Venice, that maritime hub of wealth and contact with the East, that forks first began to make their case in earnest. Venetian merchants traded silk, spices, and fine tableware, and among their imports were delicate forks from Byzantium and the Islamic world. In these cultures, forks were already accepted for certain foods, particularly sticky or messy dishes. Venetian nobles, always eager to signal their refinement, began to use them not as a replacement for fingers, but as a complement. The Venetian fork was typically two-tinned, elegant, and made of silver. Its primary purpose was to handle slippery pasta or pieces of candied fruit without smearing one's fingers. But even in Venice, this was a luxury item, an adornment to the table rather than an indispensable tool. Elsewhere in Europe, the fork met with suspicion. In England and France, some moralists regarded it as an affectation, an unnecessary separation between man and his food. God had given humans fingers. After all, why reject them? One cleric is said to have called forks a sign of excessive delicacy, implying that those who used them were too proud to touch the gifts of the earth directly. Even among the elite, the fork remained rare. It was seen as an exotic habit, a sign you had traveled or dealt with foreign merchants. For most, it was easier to stick to the familiar: a sharp knife, a steady hand, and a bit of bread to mop up juices. What truly began to tip the balance was not fashion, but hygiene. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, medical thought increasingly emphasized the dangers of contact with spoiled or tainted food. A fork allowed a diner to avoid touching certain dishes altogether, keeping fingers cleaner and reducing the spread of illness, at least in theory. Banquet culture was also changing. Feasts became more elaborate, with more courses and finer table linens. When the tablecloth itself became an object of display, there was less tolerance for greasy fingerprints. Slowly, the fork began to find a place beside the knife, first for special dishes, then for a wider range of foods. By the 16th century, the fork was firmly established among the wealthy in Italy, and from there it began to spread north. In France, Catherine de' Medici is often credited, perhaps too generously, with introducing it more widely when she married into the French royal family. In England, the fork remained slow to catch on, but travelers returning from the continent brought them home. It would still be centuries before the fork became truly common at all levels of society. For much of the medieval and early modern period, eating with one's fingers remained perfectly acceptable, provided it was done neatly and with restraint. The fork's eventual victory came not from necessity, but from the slow, inexorable pull of fashion and refinement. In the end, the shift from hand to fork was part of a larger transformation in European dining culture. Meals became less about feeding hunger as quickly as possible, and more about the performance of eating, the presentation of dishes, the elegance of utensils, the choreography of manners. The fork's presence on the table came to signal a certain kind of household, one connected to wider trade networks, attentive to foreign fashions, and concerned with projecting sophistication. In a sense, it wasn't the fork itself that mattered, but what it represented: a willingness to adopt the new, even when the old still worked perfectly well. And so, the medieval table, loud, greasy, and full of the clatter of knives, slowly gave way to something quieter, cleaner, and more measured. But one can imagine that, for the diners who had grown up tearing bread and spearing meat with a dagger, the fork must have felt like an oddly delicate tool for something as hearty and human as eating. Which raises a curious question. If the fork took centuries to win acceptance, what other obvious improvements might we be resisting today, simply because they feel foreign to our hands? If you were to write a letter in the medieval world, you would not expect it to arrive tomorrow. In fact, you might not expect it to arrive at all. Messages in this era traveled at the speed of the fastest animal you could hire, and even then, they were at the mercy of weather, war, and the simple fact that most roads were not designed for speed, but for survival. The medieval postal experience was not a tidy network of post offices and scheduled deliveries. It was a patchwork of couriers, messengers, and trusted travelers. A nobleman might have his own mounted messengers. A merchant might hand his letter to a caravan master heading in the right direction. A peasant, he might rely on asking a neighbor to tell so-and-so the next time they visited the market. The sheer unpredictability of medieval communication meant that when you wrote a letter, you also accepted the possibility of never hearing back. In most of medieval Europe, there was no centralized, government-run postal service for ordinary people. The idea of a state-supported network for delivering mail to the public simply didn't exist. Instead, the ability to send a letter depended on your social position. Royal courts had their messengers, swift riders, who carried orders across the realm. Monasteries had brothers who traveled between abbeys, carrying both spiritual and practical messages. Universities sent letters via scholars journeying from one center of learning to another. But for the common person, messages were carried by opportunity rather than schedule. If you were a farmer hoping to let your cousin know about a wedding, you might wait until someone from your village was going to pass through his town. If you were a small-town merchant placing an order, you might send your request with the next group of traders heading to the city. These informal arrangements meant messages could take days, weeks, or even months, depending on luck. Even for those who could afford a fast courier, medieval travel times were slow by modern standards. A well-mounted messenger on a good road might cover 30 to 40 miles in a day. But good road was a relative term. Many medieval roads were little more than dirt tracks, vulnerable to mud in the rain, ice in the winter, and deep ruts in all. Seasons crossing rivers meant finding ferries or fords. Passing through forests meant slowing down or risking ambush by bandits. If the letter had to cross borders, there might be tolls to pay, guards to convince, and occasional bribes to slip into the right hands. Asterisk, when you gave someone your letter, you needed to trust them. The physical security of a message depended entirely on the person carrying it. Seals made of wax and impressed with a unique mark were one way of protecting both the contents and the authenticity of a letter. A broken seal was a sign the letter had been opened, and might even render it useless if it was an official order or agreement. But seals were not foolproof. A determined spy could open, read, and reseal a message without leaving an obvious trace. This was one reason why important communications were sometimes written in code, or in deliberately vague terms that would make sense only to the intended recipient. Asterisk, imagine writing to a business partner in another city. You give the letter to a traveling merchant who promises to deliver it when he arrives. Weeks pass. You wonder if it reached him. You have no way of knowing. And then, perhaps 2 months later, a reply arrives, carried by another merchant heading in your direction. By then, the original issue might have changed entirely. In such a system, patience was not a virtue, it was a necessity. Decisions were often made without the benefit of complete information, simply because the time lag between sending and receiving a message was too long. Wars were fought, alliances made and broken, and goods bought and sold without anyone being fully sure of the latest news. The medieval world's slow, uncertain communications shaped its politics, trade, and even personal relationships. But if this was the norm, what happened when someone needed to send a message quickly, faster than ordinary channels could manage? That is where we enter the realm of royal couriers, merchant networks, and the first glimmers of something like a postal service. Asterisk, when the need for speed arose in medieval times, people turned to those who could cut through the delays of ordinary travel. Royal couriers, merchant networks, and church messengers. These were not everyday luxuries. They were costly, and in many cases, the privilege of the wealthy or powerful. Still, they formed the backbone of Europe's earliest reliable communication routes. Asterisk, kings and high-ranking nobles understood that control over communication was as vital as control over land. Messages carried orders to distant garrisons, summoned allies to war, or transmitted urgent diplomatic instructions. A royal courier could ride day and night, changing horses at way stations, a method borrowed from the ancient Roman cursus publicus, and later revived in various forms. In England, for example, the royal household employed king's messengers, who were chosen not just for their horsemanship, but for their loyalty. These messengers sometimes carried letters sewn into their clothing for safety, or hidden in the lining of saddlebags to avoid interception. The urgency was not without danger. Couriers risked robbery, capture, or worse. An intercepted royal message could change the course of a war, and those caught carrying such a letter might not live to regret it. Asterisk merchants had their own need for speed, especially those trading over long distances. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of trading cities in Northern Europe, developed a system where trusted agents and couriers could carry contracts, payment instructions, and market updates between ports. In the Mediterranean, Venetian and Genoese traders relied on ships to move not only goods, but also information. A fast galley could carry news across the sea far quicker than any land route. Merchants knew that a few days' advantage in receiving market news could mean the difference between a profitable deal and a financial disaster. Some merchant families kept their own network of messengers, riding between cities where they had offices or relatives. This was a private service, and its costs meant it was accessible only to the commercial elite. Asterisk. The medieval church was arguably the single largest organized body in Europe, and with monasteries, abbeys, and churches spread across every kingdom. It had an unparalleled communication network. Letters between bishops, abbots, and the Pope traveled along routes used by pilgrim traffic and religious envoys. Monastic orders, such as the Benedictines or Cistercians, maintained regular contact between their houses. A monk traveling on official business might carry messages, not only for his own abbey, but also for other communities along the way. These letters often dealt with ecclesiastical matters, permissions, disputes, or requests, but they could also contain political information, as the church was deeply enmeshed in medieval politics, asterisk by the late Middle Ages. In some regions, semi-formal postal routes began to appear. These were often associated with noble households or large institutions, and they relied on post houses, locations where fresh horses could be obtained, or where a messenger could rest before continuing the journey. The most famous of these emerging systems was the Thurn under Taxis postal network, which began in the late 15th century and eventually grew into the first pan-European postal service. But in the medieval centuries before it, such organization was rare, and usually existed only for a privileged few. Even with dedicated couriers, the physical limits of the era remained. A messenger could ride only so fast without exhausting his horse, and roads could still be blocked by weather, swollen rivers, or political conflict. News that took a week to travel might arrive too late to prevent a disaster, as happened more than once during medieval sieges and battles. The medieval mind accepted this slowness as part of life. Urgent messages could be sped up, but instant communication was simply unimaginable. Even the fastest network could not eliminate the inherent fragility of a letter's journey. A single unlucky encounter could mean it never arrived at all still. For all its limitations, medieval Europe's developing courier systems hinted at the possibility of something bigger. A world where sending a letter might not be a gamble. But before such systems could serve the wider population, one more group would shape the way messages moved: the ordinary travelers, pilgrims, and wanderers who carried news without ever calling themselves messengers. If the official couriers were the express lanes of medieval communication, then ordinary travelers were the winding, unpredictable back roads. Not all letters were urgent enough or important enough to justify the expense of a royal messenger or a merchant courier. In many cases, people relied on a far humbler solution, sending their messages with whoever happened to be traveling in the right direction. Asterisk pilgrimages were a defining feature of medieval life. Thousands of people each year took to the roads to visit holy sites, whether to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem. Because pilgrimage routes linked distant towns, they also became a convenient means of communication. If you knew a pilgrim headed toward a city where your friend or relative lived, you might entrust them with a letter or a verbal message. This was a low-cost option, but it was far from reliable. Pilgrims often detoured, stayed longer than planned, or simply forgot to deliver the message. And, of course, there was the matter of literacy. If your chosen pilgrim couldn't read or write, someone at the destination would need to be found to read your letter aloud. Asterisk, traveling merchants, from wealthy traders to humble peddlers, were another popular choice for informal letter delivery. They moved between towns constantly, often with a well-established circuit. If a peddler was heading to the market in the next city over, why not ask them to carry a letter? Merchants, however, could be distracted by business, delayed by weather, or robbed along the way. A stolen letter might be discarded, or worse, read by someone it wasn't meant for. Trust, therefore, was essential. The merchant who became known for losing or mishandling letters would soon stop being asked to carry them. Asterisk, in many cases, especially for the illiterate, the letter was not written at all. Instead, the messenger memorized what needed to be said. This could work surprisingly well for simple messages, such as your cousin will visit after Easter or the cartwheel is repaired. But for more complex matters, this method was risky. Messages could be forgotten, mixed up, or altered, intentionally or not, along the way. A poorly remembered set of instructions could change the meaning entirely, with consequences ranging from mild confusion to serious misunderstandings. Asterisk messages were not always benign. In an age of political intrigue, rebellion, and shifting alliances, letters could contain treasonous words or sensitive secrets. Carrying such a letter was dangerous. In some kingdoms, being caught with a message against the crown was a death sentence, whether you wrote it or not. This made trusted messengers invaluable. Some even developed coded ways of writing letters to protect both sender and carrier. Simple ciphers, misleading phrases, or the habit of splitting a message into parts carried by different people. Still, secrecy was difficult to maintain if a determined authority wanted the truth. Asterisk, for the sender, the hardest part was the waiting. After handing over a letter, there was nothing to do but hope. No tracking number, no receipt, no guarantee. It had even left the hands of the messenger. Weeks or months might pass before a reply arrived, if it arrived at all. In some cases, people traveled to deliver messages in person simply to avoid the uncertainty. This was costly and time-consuming, but for urgent matters like marriage arrangements, property disputes, or inheritance claims, it was worth the trouble. Asterisk, by the very end of the Middle Ages, change was on the horizon. The consolidation of kingdoms, the growth of trade, and the spread of literacy were all pushing toward more organized, accessible postal systems. Within a century, many parts of Europe would see regular postal routes, not just for kings and merchants, but eventually for ordinary citizens. Yet, during the medieval centuries, communication was an art of patience. Sending a message was a leap of faith, a trust in horses, strangers, weather, and luck. And perhaps that is why letters, when they did arrive, were treasured so deeply. They had survived a journey that was almost as epic as the news they carried. Asterisk, in the medieval world, the kitchen fire was far more than a cooking tool. It was the heart of the home. To let it go out was not merely inconvenient. It could mean hours of labor to rekindle it, or even a cold and hungry household for the day. In many villages, a household without a fire was as helpless as one without bread, and for good reason. Asterisk, we take modern heat and stoves for granted. But for medieval people, fire was survival. It was the source of warmth on cold nights, the means of cooking meals, and the only reliable way to boil water and make it safe to drink. In some homes, it also served as the primary light source after sunset. But unlike modern gas burners or electric stoves, a medieval fire could not simply be switched on. Lighting a new fire from scratch was a slow and difficult process, especially without matches. Most people preferred to keep their fire going continuously. A glowing bed of embers kept alive through the night so it could be coaxed into flames again in the morning. Asterisk, in most peasant homes, the hearth was in the center of the main room, an open fire pit with a simple chimney hole in the roof, if the family was lucky. Smoke often filled the room before drifting upward, leaving a constant haze that stung the eyes and blackened the rafters. The hearth served multiple roles. It was where the family gathered to eat, talk, and mend tools. It was also the only place where damp clothing could be dried, where cheese could be smoked for preservation, and where bread dough could rise in the gentle heat. Asterisk, the trick to keeping a fire going overnight was knowing how to bank it. This meant covering the glowing embers with ashes to trap the heat and slow the burn. In the morning, the housewife or servant could rake the ashes back to reveal the embers, then place dry kindling on top to reignite the flames. It sounds simple, but failure to bank the fire properly could mean waking up to a cold hearth and the daunting task of finding a new flame. Asterisk, if a household's fire went out, the quickest solution was to borrow hot coals from a neighbor. This practice was common enough that people kept small fireproof containers or pots specifically for transporting embers. But in sparsely populated areas or during bad weather, fetching fire could be dangerous or impossible. In more remote villages, fire was so valuable that some communities kept a communal hearth, a fire that burned constantly in a central building. Families could take embers from it whenever needed, ensuring that no one went without. Asterisk, if no neighbor's fire was available, the only option was to start a new one, a task requiring patience, dry tinder, and skill. The usual method involved striking a piece of steel against flint to create sparks, which were caught on a scrap of charcloth or dry moss. These embers would then be blown gently until they ignited the kindling. Even for the experienced, this process could take a long time, especially in damp weather. And if the tinder was wet or the flint dull, frustration was inevitable. Asterisk, in winter, the fire was rarely allowed to die, but in summer, some households let it go out more often, especially if they could borrow a flame quickly. Still, even in warm months, the fire was needed daily for cooking and boiling water. Seasonal tasks, like brewing ale or making soap, also depended on a steady heat source. A sudden loss of fire could spoil an entire batch, wasting valuable resources. Asterisk, the importance of fire extended beyond comfort. In cold weather, an unheated home could quickly become dangerous, especially for infants, the sick, and the elderly. Food could spoil faster without cooking or boiling, and waterborne illnesses were more likely if boiling wasn't possible. In short, losing the fire was never just an inconvenience. It was a threat to survival. While the domestic fire was the heartbeat of a single household, the idea of fire as a constant, living presence extended into the broader medieval community. A well-tended fire was a mark of responsibility, and in some cases, a symbol of authority and social standing in larger medieval manors or castles. The central hall often featured a grand fireplace or an open hearth large enough to roast entire animals. These were not only practical cooking spaces, they were stages upon which power and hospitality were displayed. A roaring fire in the Lord's Hall signaled wealth. Fuel was costly, whether it came as firewood, peat, or charcoal. To keep such a large fire burning day and night required resources and servants dedicated to cutting, drying, and hauling fuel. Guests entering a hall would feel its heat before they saw the flames, a physical reminder of the Lord's ability to provide warmth and sustenance. In many medieval towns, churches kept a sanctuary lamp or candle burning constantly before the altar. While its religious significance was paramount, it also served a practical role in emergencies. Townsfolk might go to the church to obtain flame. Some monastic communities took this further, keeping a large communal fire burning for months at a time, especially in cold climates. Monks, disciplined in their routines, ensured the fire never died, a silent act of service to the community around them. Fire, as the source of warmth and life, naturally attracted superstition. Many believed that if a household fire went out on certain days, especially during festivals or holy days, it could bring bad luck or illness. In some rural communities, it was customary to extinguish all fires in the village once a year, and then relight them from a single pure flame, often blessed by the local priest. This ritual symbolized renewal and unity, but it also reminded people of fire's fragility. Keeping a fire alive wasn't only about tending the flames. It was also about securing enough fuel to feed it. For poorer households, fuel shortages could be as pressing as food shortages. Firewood was in high demand and could be expensive in regions without abundant forests. People relied on alternatives: peat dug from bogs, bundles of dried reeds, or even animal dung shaped into bricks. Each fuel had its quirks. Peat burned slowly but produced more smoke, while dung gave a steady heat but a distinctive smell. The choice often came down to what was available, not what was pleasant. In many homes, the role of firekeeper fell to the women or younger members of the household. It was their job to make sure embers were covered at night, to rise early and coax them into flames, and to monitor the pot or cauldron during the day. This constant attention was a form of quiet labor that went uncelebrated, yet without it, meals wouldn't be cooked, water wouldn't be safe to drink, and the home would grow cold. Of course, the constant presence of fire brought risks. Kitchen fires could easily spread, especially in towns where houses were built close together, with thatched roofs. A neglected flame or a tipped-over cooking pot could reduce an entire street to ashes. Medieval towns developed strict rules about where fires could be kept, particularly during windy seasons. Some cities even employed watchmen to patrol at night, listening for signs of trouble and ready to ring an alarm bell if flames broke out. In the end, The fire wasn't just a personal or family concern, it was a shared responsibility. A lit hearth was a sign of life in a household, a symbol of stability in uncertain times. In towns and villages, the collective glow of many small fires created a sense of safety, warmth, and continuity. Despite all the care, skill, and superstition, every household at some point faced the dreaded moment, waking to a cold hearth. The embers, which the night before had glowed faintly under a layer of ash, were now lifeless and grey. The fire had gone out. The first and most pressing issue was breakfast, or, more accurately, the inability to make it without a flame. There was no way to boil water, warm bread, or cook porridge. In the depths of winter, this also meant waking up to an icy house, with frost creeping along the insides of windows and breath hanging in the air. The cold hearth wasn't just inconvenient, it could be dangerous. In damp climates, of fires, absence meant chilled bones and greater risk of illness. For those with small children or elderly family members, the urgency to rekindle it was immediate. When the fire went out, the first step was often to go to a neighbor's house with a covered pan or clay pot to carry home a live coal or small flame. This was more than a practical task. It was a social interaction that reinforced bonds between households. A neighbor willing to give you fire was a neighbor you might owe in the future, whether in bread, labor, or a warm drink. In rural villages, people sometimes walked considerable distances to borrow fire, carefully protecting the precious ember from wind and rain. Returning home, they would coax it to life with dry kindling and a careful breath, if no neighbor was available. The alternative was to start the fire from scratch, a skill much harder than it sounds to modern ears. While flint and steel could spark against charred cloth, turning that spark into a usable flame took patience, dry tinder, and a steady hand. Some regions used a fire drill, a stick spun rapidly in a notch to generate heat, but this was laborious, exhausting, and often unsuccessful in damp weather. In desperate situations, people might even break apart furniture for kindling, valuing the heat more than the wood. In some communities, having a cold hearth was considered a sign of laziness or poor housekeeping. It suggested that someone in the home had failed in their duties, a quiet failure, perhaps, but one that could become gossip if repeated. In contrast, a well-kept fire was a mark of respectability. Some women were even known locally for their skill at keeping the coals, praised for their ability to preserve a flame through the longest, coldest nights. It's worth remembering that medieval people thought of fire as a living thing. In some households, the hearth flame was considered almost part of the family. It had been burning since before the current generation was born, and might be kept alive for decades. Losing such a fire wasn't just a household inconvenience. It was like losing a piece of continuity. In rare cases, families told stories of the first fire brought to the home by a parent or grandparent, carried from a wedding feast or festival flame. Keeping it alive was a link to that origin. In times of scarcity, keeping the fire going became even more critical. If you had only a small amount of food, you didn't want to waste fuel and effort starting a fire for one meal. A steady flame meant you could prepare small amounts whenever you needed them without the extra work. A quiet form of efficiency that could make a real difference over a long, harsh winter. For modern people, starting a fire is a skill for camping or emergencies. For medieval people, it was a daily necessity. The ability to coax a spark into flame, to protect it from wind, and to keep it alive through the night was an unspoken survival art. passed down from one generation to the next. Asterisk, as you picture a medieval village at dusk, you might imagine the thin trails of smoke rising from every roof, the orange flicker behind small windows. Inside each home, someone is crouched near the hearth, checking the coals, covering them with ash, and murmuring a quiet thought, perhaps even a prayer for the fire to still be burning in the morning. And yet, in that stillness, there is a lingering question. In a time when fire was life, what did it mean for a household when that life went dark? Asterisk, if you lived in a medieval village, market day was the closest thing to both necessity and entertainment. It was where you bought goods. You couldn't produce yourself, sold what you had in surplus, and heard all the latest gossip. But before you could even think about haggling over prices or testing the freshness of bread, you had to get there, and that meant preparing for a day that could go wrong in more ways than one. Markets were often held on set days of the week, sometimes only once every 2 weeks, and missing them could mean going without certain goods for a long time. If you wanted the best deals and the freshest produce, you had to arrive early, but arriving too early could mean paying higher prices, since merchants wanted to maximize profit before lowering prices at the end of the day. The truly savvy market goer knew the sweet spot, late enough for prices to soften, early enough for there still to be something worth buying. Traveling to market wasn't just a matter of walking down the street. Many villagers walked several miles, carrying baskets or pulling small carts. If you were selling goods, you had to protect them on the way. Eggs needed straw padding, cheese had to be wrapped to keep the flies off, and fabrics had to be kept dry in case of rain. You also needed coins, and this was where the first risk of being cheated came in. Many medieval markets had multiple currencies circulating at once, from local coins to foreign silver, and not all sellers would give you a fair exchange rate. Experienced buyers carried small, well-worn coins that were harder to dispute. Upon arrival, you'd be met with a crush of people, the air thick with smells, fresh bread, roasting meat, dung from the animals, and the metallic temps of coins. The noise could be overwhelming, traders shouting prices, animals bleating, and the constant murmur of bargaining. It was easy to lose track of your purse in such a setting, and pickpockets thrived here. Many market-goers tied their coin bags to a belt under their clothes, forcing thieves to attempt an obvious reach rather than a quick snatch. One of the oldest ways to cheat a buyer was through weights and measures. A dishonest merchant might keep 2 sets of weights, heavier ones for buying so they paid less for your goods, and lighter ones for selling so you've got less for your money. Some would hollow out the base of a weight and fill it with lead, making it seem correct at first glance. The wise buyer carried their own small set of weights, or at least knew the feel of a proper one. This was no small feat. It required a practiced hand and an eye for detail, skills often passed down within families in small communities. Your reputation at market mattered almost as much as your bargaining skills. A known face might be offered better deals, while a newcomer could be overcharged just for looking inexperienced. Some villagers made a point of buying from the same merchants every market day, building a relationship based on mutual trust, and perhaps a few favors, like bringing back a foreign spice or saving a choice cut of meat for a regular. Asterisk markets were also places of temptation. Alongside essentials like grain, cloth, and tools, you'd find imported goods, bright beads, fine metalwork, or exotic spices. They were priced high, aimed at those who could be persuaded to part with more money than they planned. Part of surviving the market without being cheated was resisting these impulses, or at least haggling so well that you didn't regret it later. Finally, there were the unspoken rules of market day. Never insult the goods directly, never touch food without permission, and never start bargaining if you weren't truly interested. It was considered bad form and could ruin your standing with a seller. Breaking these rules might not get you cheated, but it could certainly make your market day much less pleasant. You've made it through the crowd, avoided the obvious cheats, and resisted or perhaps succumbed to the temptation of something unnecessary but beautiful. Yet the day is far from over, because now comes the trickiest part: bargaining without losing more than you gain. You've made it into the market without losing your purse or your patience, but now comes the part where fortunes, or at least a few pence, are won and lost: the bargain. In the medieval market, this wasn't a simple matter of how much, and I'll take it. It was a careful dance, and one misstep could mean paying double for the same sack of grain your neighbor bought for half the price. The first rule was simple: never show how badly you wanted something. The moment a merchant sensed desperation, the price went up like a cat's tail. Even if you'd been walking for miles dreaming of a fresh loaf, you had to act as though you could take it or leave it. A practiced buyer might even pretend to show more interest in a neighboring stall first, letting the real seller stew and consider lowering the price. Merchants often began with a price that was deliberately high, expecting a common approach was to offer half of what was asked, knowing the seller would reject it but come down in price. From there, both sides would edge toward the middle until a deal was struck. The key was not to cave too quickly, letting a moment of silence hang in the air could be more persuasive than a dozen words. A good bargainer knew when goods were plentiful and when they were scarce. If apples were falling off trees in late autumn, you could negotiate hard. But if you wanted fresh produce in spring, you'd have to accept higher prices. Grain after harvest was cheap. Wait until late winter, and you'd pay dearly. Market veterans kept mental calendars of these fluctuations, adjusting their offers accordingly. If you were buying cloth, you ran it through your fingers, checking for even weave and no hidden holes. For grain, you scooped a handful and let it run slowly back into the sack, watching for stones or husks that meant you were buying filler. A merchant might try to hide poor quality goods at the bottom of a sack, so the cautious buyer insisted on seeing more than the top layer. In some towns, there were market inspectors to keep such tricks in check, but their presence was no guarantee, and a bribe could make poor grain pass inspection. In a world without advertising, word of mouth was everything. Bargaining wasn't just about numbers, it was about conversation. You might ask about the merchant's family, comment on the weather, or commiserate about the long walk to market. This created a sense of familiarity that could soften a seller's stance, especially if they saw you as a neighbor rather than a stranger. It also gave you time to watch how they dealt with other customers. Were they honest with one and shrewd with another? That was information you could use. Not all goods were sold directly by the producers. Some were handled by brokers or middlemen who took a cut and often inflated the price. These were harder to bargain with, as they had less room to move on price and often more polished tricks to sway buyers. A common strategy was to walk away entirely. Sometimes the only way to get a better price was to leave and hope they called you back with a lower offer. The walk away was the market goer's best weapon. If the merchant believed you would truly go to another seller, they might drop their price immediately. but it had to be done with conviction. If you lingered or looked back too soon, you lost the advantage. Of course, walking away could also mean losing the item entirely, which made the tactic both powerful and risky. By midday, the best deals were starting to disappear, but so were the best goods. You've navigated the bargaining process without losing too much coin, and perhaps even scored a bargain or two. But now comes the part many dreaded, making sure what you bought was truly worth what you paid. You've made your purchases, the coins have changed hands, and your sack is a little heavier than when you arrived. But don't relax just yet. The medieval market still holds one last set of traps for the unwary, and some of them don't show themselves until you're miles away from the stall. Even after a price was agreed, the weight or measure could be manipulated. Stones could be hollowed out to appear heavier, or scales subtly tipped with wax or metal shavings to give false readings. Some towns had official market weights kept under lock and key, and inspectors could force sellers to use them. But inspectors weren't always present, and a wink or coin could make their eyes wander elsewhere. The smart buyer watched the weighing closely, noting if the scale dipped too slowly, a sign something sticky was interfering, or if the measure seemed unusually small for the agreed quantity. One of the most common frustrations came when a bundle was wrapped tightly and tied with twine. Inside the top layer of fine cloth or fresh vegetables might be scraps, damaged goods, or spoiled produce. That's why experienced buyers insisted on handling and examining the goods themselves before they were tied up. A particularly cautious buyer might even bring their own sack to avoid the swapping trick, where the seller switched the inspected goods for lesser ones the moment your attention wandered. If the market entrance was crowded in the morning, the exits could be worse. By late day, with people carrying coins and goods, pickpockets and cut purses worked in pairs, one creating a distraction while the other lightened your load. Children were sometimes employed for this work, slipping under elbows to cut purse strings, or grab a loaf and disappear into the crowd. Keeping one hand on your goods at all times was as important on the way home as it had been on the way in. The trip home wasn't without risk. Rural markets could be hours from home, and buyers often had to walk along lonely stretches of road. Here, highwaymen and opportunistic thieves might be waiting. Traveling in small groups reduced the danger, and sometimes sharing the walk with someone you'd haggled against earlier in the day was a safer bet than going alone. The market was competitive, but survival made for strange partnerships. In a small medieval community, reputation was as valuable as coin. If word spread that you were easily fooled, merchants would treat you accordingly next time. On the other hand, if you were known to be sharp-eyed and fair, sellers might avoid playing tricks or risk losing your business entirely. Some even cultivated friendships with specific merchants, trading loyalty for better prices and honesty in quality. A good relationship could mean the difference between getting fresh goods first or being sold. The scraps left at day's end. At last, you arrive home with your purchases intact. No missing loaves, no watered wine, and no short sacks of grain. If you manage to do this without losing your temper, your coin purse, or your goods, you could count the trip as a success. Still, you knew that next market day the same challenges would await: new tricks, new sellers, and the same timeless game of survival through caution and wit. In the medieval market, every transaction was a test of observation, patience, and self-control. To survive without being cheated was a victory in itself, one that didn't make you rich, but kept you fed and ready for the week ahead. If you were a villager, a merchant, or even a minor noble in the Middle Ages, you would spend an astonishing amount of your life simply fixing things. In fact, the entire rhythm of the medieval year, the very way you structured your days, would be shaped by repair. Clothing, shoes, tools, carts, doors, roofs, buckets. Nothing stayed pristine for long, and nothing was easily replaced. In an age before industrial manufacturing, nearly every object you owned had been made by hand, often by someone you knew personally. That meant it carried value in a way we barely register today, and it meant you'd rather patch, mend, or reforge something 10 times than pay to have it remade from scratch. The reason was simple: scarcity. A pair of iron hinges for a door might have taken a blacksmith hours to forge, and they were not cheap. Woolen tunics could take weeks of spinning, weaving, and sewing to produce. Leather for shoes had to be tanned over months, then carefully shaped by a cobbler. These were not throwaway items. They were investments of labor so dense that to replace them casually would feel almost absurd. Repairing things was also not a matter of a single fix-it day. Instead, it was a constant drip of maintenance tasks woven into daily life. You might spend the early morning tightening the lashings on your cartwheels before heading to market, then patching a rent in your cloak while chatting with a neighbor in the afternoon. If a bucket leaked, you would repair it with pitch that evening, because tomorrow you'd need it for carrying water. Let's begin with clothing, since it is perhaps the most obvious place where medieval repair culture flourished. A peasant's wardrobe might consist of just 2 or 3 sets of clothing: an undertunic, an overtunic, perhaps a hood or cloak, and stockings or hose. These garments were in near constant use and suffered all the predictable fates: fraying, cuffs, ripped seams, thinning elbows. You didn't throw them away, you darned them. Darning was the act of weaving new thread directly into the damaged fabric, reinforcing it so that the garment could last another season. Wool, the dominant textile in Northern Europe, was remarkably forgiving. Its fibers could be felted back, together with enough rubbing and moisture, meaning a skilled hand could disguise small holes. Linen, used more for underclothes and summer wear, was less forgiving, but still could be patched. Patches themselves were a point of pride, or at least necessity. A skilled wife or daughter might match the weave so closely that the repair was almost invisible. But for the poor, repairs were often obvious, turning clothing into a mosaic of different shades and fabrics. In wealthier households, clothing repairs were still common, but executed with finer materials. Embroidered patches might even serve as decorative flourishes, blurring the line between necessity and ornament, no matter the status. Few in medieval Europe considered new the default solution to a tear. Footwear in the Middle Ages had a short lifespan, especially for those who worked outdoors. Leather soles wore through quickly, and wet weather warped the shape of shoes and boots. Rather than buy new ones each time, people regularly took their footwear to a cobbler for resoling. A single pair of shoes might receive 3, 4, or even 5 new soles before the uppers were deemed beyond saving. In some villages, traveling cobblers would visit seasonally, their carts filled with leather scraps, awls, and hammers. If you lived far from such a service, you might make rough repairs, yourself stitching with heavy thread, plugging gaps with extra scraps of hide. The smell of fresh tanned leather and beeswax polish was a familiar one in medieval homes, a small sign of life's ongoing upkeep. Iron tools were the backbone of survival, but they were not indestructible. Axes dulled, scythes lost their edges, hammers cracked. and each was expensive iron or had to be mined, smelted, forged, and shaped. As such, sharpening, rehafting, and reforging were standard parts of life. Handles, typically made of ash or oak, often split or wore down long before the metal head was unusable. Rather than discard the whole thing, you would simply replace the handle. In fact, the medieval mindset toward tools was so thoroughly rooted in repair that the same axe head might see multiple generations of handles. There's even a medieval legal case in England over a dispute about whether a tool repaired so many times still counted as the original object for inheritance purposes. Kitchen utensils were no different. Pewter mugs were soldered, wooden spoons were reshaped, and ceramic jugs were repaired with lead staples of practice that left them looking like they had stitches, as if the pots themselves had been sewn back together. Your home was not immune to this cycle. Thatched roofs had to be patched yearly. DAUB walls needed replastering. Wooden shutters swelled and shrank with the seasons, cracking in the process. Floors, often just beaten earth, developed ruts that needed leveling. Doors sagged on their hinges, which required tightening or reheating to reshape. For many rural families, autumn was the fixing season for buildings after harvest, but before the deep cold set in, you'd cut new reed bundles for thatching, mix fresh lime for whitewashing walls, and mend holes chewed by rodents. Even castles, for all their stone grandeur, were maintenance-heavy. Wooden floors in the great hall warped from spilled ale, and draughty windows needed constant adjustment. Interestingly, repair was not always solitary. Villages often had communal repair days, especially for shared tools or infrastructure like mills, bridges, and wells. You might spend the morning helping re-rope the communal well bucket, then receive help in the afternoon, replastering your own cottage. Even in cities, repair was part of the soundscape. Hammering from a blacksmith's shop, the rhythmic scrape of a cobbler's knife, the metallic ring of a tinker repairing pots. The mend and make-do ethos was so ingrained that people judged your household competence by how well you kept things in working order. A neglected fence or visibly warped door could be a mark of laziness or poverty. Living in such a culture gave people a different relationship with time and possessions. You would not expect perfection, you expected wear. A new object was not prized for its untouched state, but for its potential to serve for years, decades, even if cared for. And because you had so few possessions, you were deeply familiar with each one. You knew every chip in your mug, every stitch in your cloak, every knot in the haft of your axe. This intimacy with objects was not romanticized, was simply life. If your cloak tore, you didn't mourn its ruin, you set about fixing it. This steady rhythm of use, repair, and continued use gave life a kind of circular predictability. Yet even in this world of endless fixing, there were moments when repair failed, when the iron cracked beyond reforging, when the cloth frayed into ribbons. And in those moments, a decision had to be made to invest the time and resources in making a new one, or to go without for a season. But before we explore the slow, painstaking process of creating something from scratch, you must ask yourself, in a world where every object could be endlessly mended, what did new really mean? In the Middle Ages, the decision to replace something was not casual, it was momentous. Every replacement represented days, weeks, or even months of labor, whether your own or someone else's. Before you reached that point, you would have exhausted every possible method of keeping the old item alive. When repairs finally failed, the process of starting over was an exercise in patience that modern minds often struggle to imagine. Today, we can replace nearly anything with a click and a credit card. In medieval Europe, every new object had to be made, and making took time, a lot of it. Asterisk, let's take clothing as an example. If your tunic had reached the point of no returns, so thin it was more air than wool, or so patched it could no longer hold together, getting a new one was a full-scale production. It began with raw material. If you were lucky, your household had sheep, and you could shear them yourself in late spring. The wool would then need to be washed, teased apart, carded, spun into yarn, woven into cloth, and finally cut and sewn into shape. Every stage required skill and equipment: carding combs, spinning wheels or drop spindles, looms, shears, needles. In many peasant households, these tasks were divided across the year, woven into other work. A woman might spin in the evenings, by the fire, weave in the quieter months, and so during winter, when outdoor labor slowed, from start to finish, one garment could take months. And that's assuming you had the raw materials and didn't need to buy them, which added even more time as you worked to earn or trade for the goods. For the wealthy, the process was faster only because they could outsource it to skilled artisans. Tailors in towns and cities could work more quickly, but even they were limited by the pace of hand production. Shoes were no easier. New leather didn't come from a shop. It came from a cow or sheep hide that had to be tanned, a process that could take months, involving repeated soaking, scraping, and treating with tannins from tree bark. Tanners' yards were infamous for their smell, as rotting flesh and strong chemicals mixed in the open air. Once the leather was ready, a cobbler would cut and stitch it into shoes tailored to your feet. But leather was expensive, and cobblers themselves were not cheap. This is why most people would rather pay to have shoes repaired again and again rather than start fresh. A new iron tool meant working with a blacksmith, and the cost of the iron itself could be as much as the labor. Blacksmiths needed, or charcoal, and a furnace capable of reaching high temperatures. Forging was slow, repetitive work, with each piece shaped blow by blow on the anvil. A single knife might take several hours to forge, harden, sharpen, and polish. For larger tools, axes, plowshares, scythes, the process was even longer, and you might find yourself in a queue if your local smith was busy with orders for the harvest season. If the item needing replacement was part of your home, a door, a shutter, or even a whole section of wall, the timeline was even slower. Without sawmills, boards were cut by hand. Without power tools, every mortise and tenon joint was made with hand chisels and mallets. Stonework required not only a mason but also laborers to transport the stone, shape it, and set it in place. Even simple materials like thatch or waterland took time to prepare. Thatch had to be harvested, dried, and bundled before use. Daub, a mix of clay, straw, and sometimes dung, had to be kneaded and applied in layers, each one drying before the next went on. Because new required such investment, it carried emotional weight. A new cloak wasn't just something to wear, it was a mark of the hours of spinning and sewing that had gone into it. A new plough blade might be treated with reverence, because it represented not just iron and labor, but also the harvests it would enable. In some cases, new was even ceremonial. Newly forged swords, for example, might be blessed before battle. New houses were marked with rituals to ensure good fortune. The scarcity and effort of replacement turned new possessions into events. Importantly, new in the medieval sense didn't always mean entirely fresh materials. Often, the failed item would be cannibalized for parts. Leather straps from worn-out shoes could become binding for tools. Cloth from a ruined tunic might be cut down into children's clothes, or used as cleaning rags, or stuffed into mattress. Ticking dot iron was particularly valuable. Nails were pulled from collapsed buildings, melted down, and reefed. In many medieval towns, laws required that any scrap metal be brought to the local smith rather than thrown away. In this way, the medieval cycle of repair and replacement was not a straight line from broken to discarded to new. It was a loop where the end of one object often became the beginning of another. And this brings us to an important truth. In the Middle Ages, repair wasn't just an economic necessity, it was a way of thinking, a habit of mind. To live then was to see every object not as a finished thing, but as a work in progress. Asterisk, if you lived in the Middle Ages, you didn't just repair things yourself. There was an entire ecosystem of tradespeople whose livelihoods depended on keeping the old running just a little longer. These specialists formed the backbone of medieval towns and villages, and their presence shaped the rhythms of daily life. The cobbler's shop was a place of both salvation and frustration. Cobbler repairs were often quick stitching on a new sole, patching a hole, but they weren't always cheap, and the work was visible. A pair of shoes with mismatched leather or oversized stitches told the world that you were stretching the life of your footwear. Woodwainers, by contrast, worked with fresh leather to make new shoes. In theory, you might have preferred for quality, but in practice, the cobbler's more affordable patchwork kept him busier. From horseshoes to kitchen knives, the blacksmith was the indispensable fixer of the community. In small villages, the smith might also serve as the general metal worker, repairing pots, hinges, nails, and even armor. The smithy's forge was rarely cold, and its steady rhythm of hammer on anvil was the background music of medieval life. Repairs here could be dramatic. Bent iron straightened with a single blow, painstaking, like reforging the blade of a broken scythe. Not every repair shop had a fixed location. The tinker, a traveling mender of pots and pans, was a common figure in both towns and rural areas. Equipped with a small portable forge or brazier, the tinker could patch holes in metal cookware using solder and skill. Tinkers were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Wandering tradespeople could be accused of theft or laziness, but they were indispensable for communities too small to support a permanent metal worker. Every hole, tear, and frayed seam eventually made its way to a needle worker. In poorer households, mending was done at home, but the local seamstress or tailor could perform repairs that were neater, stronger, or more fashionable. Tailors often worked on garments for the wealthy, but they also did alterations and patchwork. For ordinary folk, making old clothes fit new bodies or styles. A particularly skilled tailor could disguise a patch so well that it almost looked like the garment had never been damaged. Wood was everywhere in medieval lifehouses. Carts, tools, and furniture all depended on it. Carpenters repaired structural damage, replaced broken beams, and rebuilt doors and shutters. Wheelwrights were specialists in the construction and repair of cartwheels, a job requiring precision and a deep understanding of how wood and iron worked together. A wheel could take days to repair, especially if it needed a new iron tire fitted. Yet without functioning wheels, transport and trade ground to a halt, making the wheelwright's work vital. Glass was a luxury, but where it existed in churches, in the homes of the wealthy, it needed occasional repair. Glazers could replace broken panes, repair lead framework, or create new stained glass designs. In most homes, however, window repair meant replacing wooden shutters or patching holes in oiled cloth or parchment coverings. Even this humble task might require the skills of a joiner or carpenter. What all these trades shared was their deep connection to the community. Repairing an object was not a solitary transaction. It was part of an ongoing relationship. You knew the cobbler who had patched your shoes last winter, the smith who had sharpened your sickle before harvest, the tinker who had stopped by once a year to fix your pans. These repairs carried stories. A pot might bear the mark of 3 different tinkers, each a ghost from a different decade. A cloak might contain fabric stitched by a grandmother, altered by a tailor, and patched again by its current owner in this way. Medieval repair trades were more than just jobs. They were keepers of continuity, binding the present to the past. With every stitch, nail, and rivet. In the medieval world, taxes were not a single tidy payment made once a year to a faceless government. Instead, they formed a sprawling, tangled web of dues, tolls, rents, and tithes, all owed to different people for different reasons. You could be born into debt without ever borrowing a coin, simply because your land, your labor, or even your very presence belonged at least in part to someone else. The word tax itself might be misleading here. Much of what we would call taxes in the Middle Ages were not standardized state levies, but rather obligations that came from personal relationships, social hierarchy, and local custom. These could be as formal as a royal decree, or as informal as a tradition so old no one remembered its origin. At the top of the feudal pyramid sat the king or queen, who technically owned all the land in the realm. Below them were powerful lords and barons, who held estates in exchange for loyalty, military service, and various forms of payment. Those lords, in turn, granted smaller parcels of land to knights or minor nobles, who owed their own obligations upward. At the bottom were peasants and serfs, who worked the land and owed rent or service to their immediate lord. But here's the twist. Your lord might also owe taxes to someone else, which meant your rent indirectly helped pay their dues. You weren't just funding one person, you were part of a chain reaction of payments. The average medieval villager might face rent for land use, paid to the local lord, often in produce or labor. Tithes to the church, traditionally 1/10 of your harvest, collected by the parish priest. Feudal incidents, special payments, due when your lord's son was knighted or his daughter married. Market tolls, fees to sell goods in the local market. Bridge and road tolls, paid to pass along certain routes. And that's before you even consider royal taxes, which might be imposed in times of war or for extraordinary expenses. A very flexible phrase indeed. Asterisk. The fascinating thing about medieval taxes is how they blurred the line between financial duty and personal loyalty. You didn't just pay because it was the law you paid, because that was your place in the order of things. Failing to meet an obligation could be both a legal and a moral offense, a stain on your reputation as much as a breach of contract. Some obligations were so old and specific they seemed almost whimsical. A miller might owe his lord a yearly sack of the first milled grain. A village might provide the bishop with a set number of candles each Easter, and a fisherman could be required to deliver his first catch of the season to the local abbey. No matter how small it was, this network of overlapping debts meant that everyone, from kings to the poorest serfs, something to someone. Even monarchs paid tribute to other rulers in certain situations. A reminder that no one in the medieval world was entirely free from the chains of obligation. In the medieval world, paying your taxes often didn't mean handing over coins because Most people didn't have many coins to begin with. The economy in rural Europe, especially before the late Middle Ages, ran largely on barter, obligation, and in-kind payments. If you were a peasant farmer, your currency was whatever your land and labor could produce. If your lord demanded rent, you might pay him with sacks of grain, barrels of ale, or wheels of cheese. A shepherd might settle his dues with fleeces or lambs. Some tenants owed their lord honey, fish, or even bundles of firewood. The form of payment often depended on what your village produced most readily. One of the most common obligations was corvée labor and paid work on your lord's land. A serf might be required to work 3 days a week, ploughing, harvesting, or maintaining roads. These days were in addition to tending your own plot of land. Failure to show up could bring fines or other penalties. Some obligations were oddly specific. A miller might owe the lord a certain amount of time each year repairing the manor's mill. A blacksmith might be required to shoe the lord's horses without charge. And fishermen might ferry messages along a river when called upon by the 12th and 13th centuries. As towns grew and trade expanded, coinage became more common. Lords and kings increasingly preferred money taxes because coins could be spent anywhere. This led to a gradual shift from in-kind rents to cash payments, change that, ironically, sometimes increased the burden on peasants, who had to sell produce just to get coins. The collection of these taxes could be a formal event. Sometimes the lord's steward, accompanied by armed guards, would tour the villages, keeping a careful tally of payments. Other times, the payment had to be brought to the manor house or castle at a set date, known as a rent day. The process was public, which added a layer of social pressure. If your neighbor saw you arrive empty-handed, it was clear you were behind on your dues. Dangerous position that could invite both gossip and legal trouble. If you failed to pay, the consequences could be swift. A steward might seize livestock, tools, or even the very grain you were counting on to feed your family. In extreme cases, land could be taken away, forcing you to seek work as a laborer elsewhere. That said, most lords had a practical interest in not pushing their tenants too far. Starving peasants couldn't work the land, and abandoned villages meant lost revenue. Occasionally, a bad harvest would lead to partial forgiveness of dues. But such leniency was more a matter of preserving productivity than generosity. Even townsfolk, who had more direct access to coins, weren't free from the weight of obligation. They paid market tolls, store fees, and guild dues. Merchants might have to grease the palms of multiple officials just to move goods from one town to another. In some places, river crossings had toll stations every few miles, each one taking a bite out of a trader's profit. By now, you can see that medieval taxes were less a neat financial system and more an unending cycle of obligations, personal, local, and royal. But the real strain came when extraordinary taxes were imposed, usually to fund wars or special projects. These could upend the fragile balance of village life. You've now seen how the web of ordinary taxes in the Middle Ages was enough to keep a person's days full of labor and their purse empty of coins. But there was another category of tax, one that struck deeper into the heart of medieval life: the extraordinary levy. These were not routine dues for land or services. They were sudden demands, often large, and nearly always tied to a pressing need of the realm. Extraordinary taxes most often came when a ruler decided Dor was forced to go to war. Medieval armies were expensive to raise, while a lord could call on his vassals to provide knights and soldiers under the feudal system. Large campaigns required mercenaries, siege equipment, provisions, and ships. These wars could be far from home. An English peasant in the 14th century might find himself funding a war in France through the notorious wool tax, a levy on the kingdom's most valuable export. A French merchant might face a special trade toll to help build fortifications hundreds of miles away. Unlike regular taxes, these were justified as temporary. The word temporary in medieval politics, however, was flexible. A tax introduced for a single campaign often lingered for decades, evolving into yet another permanent obligation. Not all extraordinary taxes were secular. The Church, with its vast influence, sometimes imposed levies to fund crusades or special projects, like cathedral building. These were often framed as spiritual obligations. Payment could be linked to promises of indulgences or blessings. While the faithful might have welcomed the idea of contributing to a holy cause, the sums involved could still strain households. Even monasteries, wealthy as some were, could feel the pinch. They often had to extract more from their tenant farmers to meet the Church's demands. In effect, the burden trickled down the social ladder until it landed on the people least able to bear it, of course. No society endlessly accepts heavier and heavier burdens without resistance. Sometimes, extraordinary taxes were the spark that set off open rebellion. The peasants' revolt of 1381 in England is a prime example. The trigger was a deeply unpopular poll tax charged per person, regardless of wealth levied, to fund the crown's military campaigns in France. For families already struggling, paying the same amount as wealthy merchants or minor nobility felt not just unfair, but insulting. The revolt began in Essex and Kent, swelling as angry villagers marched toward London. Their demands included the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, and the end of oppressive taxes. While the rebellion was eventually crushed, it shook the monarchy enough to make rulers think twice before imposing similar levies in the same way. These cycles of taxation, discontent, and occasional revolt shaped medieval governance in subtle but lasting ways. Kings learned that extraordinary taxes required political bargaining, negotiating with nobles, towns, and sometimes even the wider population. In England, for instance, this bargaining helped give rise to the Magna Carta in 1215, which included clauses limiting the king's ability to raise certain taxes without the consent of his barons. Over centuries, these principles evolved into more formal systems of parliamentary approval for taxation, a cornerstone of later democratic governance. For the ordinary medieval person, the logic of taxation boiled down to a simple reality. You always owed something to someone, whether it was a chicken for the manor steward, a coin for the market toll, or a sack of wool for the king's army. Your labor and goods were perpetually feeding into systems of power you could rarely influence. The price of loyalty to your lord or your king was rarely measured in fair exchange. Instead, it was a constant background cost of survival, another part of life's rhythm, like planting in spring and harvesting in autumn. And yet, without these taxes, ordinary and extraordinary alike castles would crumble, armies would disband, and even the great cathedrals of Europe might never have been built. The burden was heavy, but it kept the machinery of medieval society moving. In the end, medieval taxation wasn't just about money or goods. It was about maintaining a vast, layered system of obligations that bound everyone from the humblest serf to the most powerful nobilant to a web of mutual dependence. And while the forms of taxation have changed, the underlying truth remains. Power always finds a way to collect its due. When you picture a medieval road, you might imagine something straight from a fairy tale illustration, a charming cobblestone lane winding through green hills, perhaps with a quaint little bridge over a sparkling brook. That's not what most travelers encountered. In reality, a road in much of medieval Europe was simply the most used path between 2 points trampled by feet, hooves, and cartwheels, until the grass was worn away. Paving was rare outside cities and important trade centers, and even there, maintenance could be questionable. If the path became too muddy in winter or too rutted in summer, people and carts simply moved a few feet to the side and started a new track. Over time, what was once a single road could become a wide band of overlapping paths, none of them particularly smooth or predictable. In some places, the ghost of the Roman Empire still lingered. Roman roads, famously well built, survived in parts of Britain, France, and Italy. These ancient highways were straight, well-drained, and paved with stone. Unfortunately, by the Middle Ages, many had fallen into disrepair. Missing stones, overgrown weeds, and collapsed bridges turned even the best routes into hazardous obstacle courses. And there was another problem. Roman engineers built their roads for empire, not convenience. Some medieval travelers preferred winding dirt tracks that connected local markets or villages. Even if the old Roman road was technically faster, when it wasn't covered in weeds, the seasonal transformation of roads was a source of endless frustration. In wet months, dirt paths became rivers of mud so deep that carts could get stuck for days. In dry months, they turned into choking dust clouds, leaving travelers coughing and squinting. Horses slipped in both conditions, but in different, equally embarrassing ways. If you were unlucky enough to break a cartwheel far from a town, your journey could grind to a halt entirely. Spare parts weren't exactly sold at roadside stands. The state of medieval roads wasn't just inconvenient, could be dangerous. Highwaymen and bandits thrived along less patrolled stretches, especially near forests. Roads that skirted marshes or narrow valleys could funnel travelers into perfect ambush points. For that reason, merchants often traveled in caravans, hiring guards for safety. Pilgrims might band together, both for companionship and for the practical matter of not being robbed of their food before reaching the next holy shrine. A medieval road was less a guarantee of safe passage and more a gamble one that required patience, luck, and sturdy boots. Travel in the Middle Ages was as much about endurance as it was about distance. A journey of 20 miles, a casual drive today, could consume an entire day if the weather turned. Your horse lost a shoe, or you encountered one of the many bottlenecks of medieval life. On foot, a traveler could expect to cover roughly 2 to 3 miles an hour on decent ground. With a good horse and a road in fair condition, you might manage 5 to 6 miles an hour at a trot. But fair condition was rare. Most of the time, you were lucky to keep a steady pace at all. Merchants hauling goods faced even more delays. A wagon loaded with grain, wool, or pottery moved at the mercy of the road. Too much weight and you risked breaking an axle. Too little and you might be accused of avoiding tolls by not carrying your fair share of trade. And if one wagon in your caravan got stuck, everyone waited. Medieval roads came with a patchwork of toll stations. Lords, bishops, and towns all claimed rights to collect money from passers-by. Sometimes these tolls were legitimate, paying for the upkeep of bridges or causeways. Other times, they were little more than legal extortion. Your payment lined the pockets of whoever controlled that stretch of road. And then there were the truly unofficial tolls. exacted by groups of men with more muscle than moral authority. If they didn't look like bandits, it was because they technically weren't, at least. Not under local law, the medieval traveler lived at the mercy of the seasons. Heavy rain could wash out entire sections of road, forcing detours through fields or woods. In winter, ice and snow slowed movement to a crawl, making some routes impassable until spring in low-lying areas. Sudden floods could strand travelers for days on the wrong side of a river. If you were carrying perishable goods like fish or fresh bread, this could mean financial ruin. Pilgrims delayed by weather might miss important feast days at their destinations, turning months of walking into a journey with no spiritual payoff. Even if you survived the day's roads without breaking an axle or losing your purse, there was still the problem of where to sleep. Large towns might have inns, though they were expensive and often overcrowded. Rural travelers had to rely on the hospitality of monasteries, village households, or simply make camp along the road, subtracting attention from wildlife and less than friendly humans alike. If you did manage to find shelter, it might be a shared room with straw bedding, a smoky fire, and unfamiliar companions who snored, coughed, and occasionally relieved themselves in a corner bucket. The poor state of medieval roads was more than a mere inconvenience. It shaped the very fabric of daily life, the limits of economies, and the reach of political power. Travel was slow, expensive, and dangerous, not because medieval people lacked ambition, but because their infrastructure demanded a certain patience and endurance that modern life has almost entirely forgotten. Merchants understood that every mile traveled carried a cost, and not just in time. Bad roads meant higher wear on carts, pack animals, and shoes. Breakages were common, and replacing a wagon wheel or a set of iron horseshoes was costly. These expenses added to the price of goods, making some items, especially bulky ones like salt, timber, or stone, far more expensive the further they traveled. It also meant that trade routes tended to cluster along rivers and coastal areas. Waterways were the medieval equivalent of highways, smoother, faster, and far more reliable. A single barge could carry more than a dozen wagons worth of goods, and with less risk of axle breakage or toll extortion. As a result, inland towns, far from navigable rivers, often remained smaller, poorer, and more isolated. The sheer difficulty of overland travel encouraged communities to become as self-sufficient as possible. Most villagers produced their own bread, brewed their own ale, and made their own tools. Trade did happen, but usually in items that were either impossible to make locally, like fine cloth from distant weavers, or so valuable that their high price could absorb the costs of travel, like spices or precious metals. Even news traveled slowly. A royal decree issued in the capital might take weeks or months to reach the more remote corners of a kingdom, and by the time it arrived, the situation might already have changed. Bad roads also influenced warfare. Armies moved at the pace of their slowest carts, which carried food, weapons, and tents. In muddy seasons, this could reduce an army's progress to a handful of miles a day. Some battles were never fought at all, because one side could not arrive in time. Others were decided not by strategy on the field, but by who could get supplies to their soldiers fastest without being bogged down by the terrain. Pilgrimages were a major part of medieval spiritual life, but the condition of roads shaped where people went. Many pilgrims opted for local shrines rather than grand, distant destinations, simply because the journey was too risky or slow. The devout who braved longer roads often did so in groups for protection. forming temporary traveling communities that could share food, water, and news along the way. In the end, medieval roads reflected the priorities and limitations of the societies that built or neglected them. Where a ruler saw political or economic advantage, roads were improved, stone causeways laid, bridges reinforced, drainage ditches dug. But in much of the countryside, maintenance was left to local communities who had neither the resources nor the incentive to keep them in top condition. The result was a Europe where the journey was rarely just a means to an end, was an ordeal in itself, shaping who you met, what you could buy, and how far your world extended. And so, when you imagine medieval life, it's worth remembering, it wasn't just the castles, the markets, or the cathedrals that defined it. It was also the deep, sucking mud, the splintering wagon wheels, and the endless patience required to simply get from one place to another.